Clorinde is a very cool 5-star Electro Main DPS that is capable of triggering many reactions, which means she can be very flexible in terms of team comps. Hi, this is Earlbedo. In this video, I will give you the top 3 teams you can try with Clorinde. I will also give some honorable mentions, so stick around until the end since there are just a lot of them. Let's get started. Top 3 is Quickbloom. The name comes from 2 very strong reactions. First is Quicken. Quicken is achieved by applying Dendro, then Electro, or vice versa to the enemy. Quicken doesn't have any damage, it's just an aura which you can see once applied. The damage comes from applying either Dendro to trigger spread, or applying Electro to trigger aggravate when the enemy has the Quicken aura. This reaction is considered a catalyzed reaction, which just means that it adds damage on top of your character's base damage. What's great with this is it actually crits. We'll talk more about the specific numbers on the other teams and reactions that I will mention. The next reaction involved in this team is Hyperbloom. This reaction is considered one of the strongest in game. And for me, this is actually the top and strongest reaction. To trigger Hyperbloom, you need to create this Dendro course by applying Hydro to a Dendro affected enemy or vice versa. After the cores are created, hitting it with an Electro will trigger Hyperbloom, which then follows enemies like a missile, dealing Dendro damage. Now that you know how this team works, you might have at least one of these 2 questions in mind. First, why is this not the top 1 team if I mentioned that this is the strongest reaction for me? The reason why this is just top 3 is because Hyperbloom scale entirely off EM and character level of the one triggering it. Clorinde is attack scaling, so EM is just a secondary stat for her. Using this team doesn't mean you need to stack 1000 EM to Clorinde, but you can definitely add some EM after stacking crit and attack. Regardless, Hyperbloom is still strong even if Clorinde is not an EM build. The next question you might ask is, why is this team called Quickbloom if we can just call it Hyperbloom? The main difference between the two is the level of Hydro application the Hydro character involved can do. In Hyperbloom, you want as much Hydro application as Dendro to make sure you will create many Dendro cores. In Quickbloom teams, you need slower Hydro application to make way for Dendro and Electro to trigger Quicken. Too much Hydro can prohibit triggering Aggravate for Clorinde. This leads us to the team composition. Here, aside from Clorinde, you want a strong off-field Dendro applicator. Luckily, the list of Dendro characters we have is mostly actually good in this. The top choice for Dendro is of course Nahida, as she can consistently apply Dendro for a very long time while also buffing EM of Clorinde, which is very helpful to buff Hyperbloom damage. The second choice is MEOW, who can apply Dendro to the enemies as well as heal the team, followed by the Dendro Traveler, then Calling. You can also add Baiju with the other Dendros I mentioned, as he will provide healing and pseudo shield, but most importantly, he buffs Dendro related reactions. Of course, let us not forget about Kirara too. For Hydro, we need an off-fielder, so we can still use Shengshou, but make sure to avoid sticking near enemies to at least lessen the Hydro application. Shengshou is just too good at applying Hydro, especially at C6. A remedy for this is to have 2 Dendros in your team if you're playing with him. Can you just stop being wet for a second, Shengshou, please? I think the best option for this is C0 Yelan. She is one step behind Shengshou in terms of Hydro application, which is actually perfect. She has a very high personal damage, as well as the ability to buff party members' damage by up to 50%. Another Hydro you can use is Furina. Just like Yelan, she has a decent Hydro application. Not the best, but not the worst, so it's perfect. She can also directly buff Clorinde's personal damage, as well as deal massive damage with her skill. Here is a sample team you can use. You see, even though the numbers are not the highest and biggest for Aggravate and Hyperbloom, their collective damage is actually quite good. Our top 2 best team is Overload. I know a lot of you might be surprised, but Chevreuse made a very strong entrance as a support. Although she has restrictions, I can say that her support capabilities rivals Bennett and even 5-star Animo supports like Kazuha. I had a lot of fun using her with my Arlecchino and Raiden Shogun with Overload. Just take a look at this. Her damage buff is so strong that it is at par with Kazuha. Although many might think that this reaction is one of the weakest in the game, it is Chevreuse that actually makes it worth it. Of course, you can still use the team without Chevreuse, but we will be focusing on Overload teams with Chevreuse. So, here is why the team is very strong with her. As long as all of your teammates are Pyro and Electro only, she works wonders. When the characters trigger an overload reaction, she will decrease Pyro and Electro resistance of opponents by up to 40%. That's like Kazuha with a Viridescent Vener reset. And that's not all. After an overload reaction, you will see this bullet icon, and once you fire her skill, the team's attack is increased by up to 40% based on her HP. And it's not even finished yet, she also heals. She can heal Clorinde once Clorinde is off field, or if Clorinde is using her skill, her bond of life can be increased by healing. So it's a win-win. Lastly, what's great about Chevreuse is you actually don't need to level any of her skills unless you want high healing. Aside from Chevreuse and Clorinde, the other two crazy buffers you can add to the team are actually 4 stars again. It's Sarah and Bennett. Both of them provide crazy attack to Clorinde. Bennett can also heal and increase bond of life of Clorinde, while Sarah can also act as a battery to the team. If you are using this team, make sure to actively proc the overload reaction every 6 seconds to activate Chevreuse debuff to enemies. And you can also substitute Strangling to Sarah or Bennett to provide additional damage. Toma can also work as he provides shield as well as a good enough pyro to trigger overload damage, and he can also buff Clorinde's normal attack. Of course, other strong Electro sub DPSs like Fischl, who has a very good synergy with Clorinde due to Clorinde's fast normal attacks, Yae, Miko, and Beidou are also very welcome for extra damage. But one downside of this team is when used against small enemies, they will be scattered, so I suggest using this team with big bosses or enemies that cannot be easily knocked back. And of course, another thing to consider here is you can only use Pyro and Electro characters. Overall, this team is very F2P friendly and efficient in terms of materials. Before we continue, if you are enjoying this video, please subscribe to my channel because I make Genshin Impact guides like this almost every week. And our top 1 team for Clorinde is Aggravate. I think this is pretty obvious since Electro Main DPS's strongest reaction is Aggravate. As mentioned earlier, to trigger Aggravate, first you need to apply the Quicken Aura to the enemies, then apply Electro. What happens is, it gives an additive damage similar to Shenhe and Yunjin's buff. Basically, it adds flat damage bonus on top of the damage of your character. If you're interested in the math, here's the calculation. The additive damage bonus is computed as reaction multiplier, which is 1.15 for Aggravate, times the level multiplier, times EM multiplier. I know this might be too much for some, even for me, but to make the most out of Aggravate, try to give some EM to Clorinde and also max her level out. In this team, Dendro application must be stronger than Electro to guarantee that it is Clorinde that triggers the reaction and not the Dendro character. To do that, you can either use Nahida since she has a strong Dendro application while also buffing EM to buff Aggravate, or you can also use 2 off-field Dendro characters. It is simpler than Quickbloom since you just have 2 elements for this to work. The last slot should be reserved for an element that will not disturb the reaction, so you should not use other elements aside from Geo and Animo. So Kazuha is a great choice for elemental damage buff, resistance shred with Viridescent Vener, and also crowd control. Sucrose also does the same since she has more EM boosting capabilities and also elemental damage bonus at C6. Zhongli is also good since he has shield, plus he can shred enemies' resistance, as well as wear the tenacity of Millelith to buff attack. My favorite is adding Yunjin to the team as she can directly buff Clorinde's normal attack and attack speed. You may also use other Electro off-field DPSs to provide additional damage, but of course expect that they might compete with Clorinde in triggering Aggravate. Now, here are some honorable mentions. Hypercare team, which focuses on buffing Clorinde's normal attack without the need of sub DPSs. Last is Stacer team. Here you need to pair her up with strong off-field Hydro users like Yelan and Sengsho. Clorinde might not be the strongest DPS in game and she might not give the biggest numbers like Arlecchino or Neuvillette do, but what makes her stand out is her flexibility in terms of team comps. This makes her very fun to use. How about you? What are your top team comps for Clorinde? Comment below. Again, this is Earlbedo. See you next time.